I've spent the majority of my life working in the outdoors as a soldier, outdoorsman, and guide. Many years ago, I came to a crossroad in my military career. I felt like I was at the point where I was no longer able to learn about survival from the military. So I searched and I watched as many new shows popped up like Dual Survival, Survivor Man, and others. Shows that partnered seasoned soldiers with primitive living instructors. I watched experienced soldiers who had amazing skills with tools fall short without them, and I had to look deep within myself and ask why. So, realizing that something was missing in my training, I then formulated a plan. I set out to find people with these skills in my area, to find out who they were, where they come from, who taught them, and more importantly, how could I learn and master these skills for myself. This journey has led me to a place where I have had the privilege of teaching these things that I love to others. Skills that now range from advanced navigation to primitive fire. This is my journey to primitive. This is my story, yet it is a story that has never really been about me. One of the first people that I met along my journey to primitive was Dave Holladay. This is Dave Holladay's story.
Hello, I'm David Holladay. This is where I live most of the time. When I'm not on the trail or off being on some big adventure with friends or clients. I make my living most of the time teaching primitive skills or outdoor living skills. I started off being an outdoor survival instructor a long time ago in the 70s and began to admire those who thrived and lived on the land as a little kid and thought, well, I don't want to survive. I want to thrive. I want to be here on the land's terms. And so my pursuit for about 18 years as an instructor at Boulder Outdoor Survival School was to see what maybe the people before us were doing here, try to mimic their behavior and find a way to actually live here and not survive here. And so that's who I am more than anything else, is somebody who's been pursuing the idea of living with the earth, enjoying being here. The joke I told somebody who wasn't very happy with me once, who was a student of mine, who was a doctor and very afraid of all the things that could kill a human being because he'd seen them. He'd gotten lost in the first 2 hours of a 30-day trip. He'd gotten lost 3 times. At least that's what he said. I knew where he was. But he was angry and he said, "You haven't taught me staying found principles." And I looked at him and I said, "You better talk to Mike Ryan because he's the one that teaches those principles things. I just teach how to be here. In fact, sir, I've been trying to figure out how to never have to go back to town. My whole thing is, how could we disappear and never go back?" He didn't think that was funny. I think Mona Dayton, my first grade teacher, took us to the University of Arizona's Archaeological Museum when I was a first grader. And I looked through the glass at a display that was on the second floor of that museum that had a bunch of little miniature mammoth hunters taking down a mammoth. And then it showed that mammoth hunting site 100 years after the kill, 1,000 years after the kill, and 10,000 years after the kill. And there were the little miniatures that you looked through this window to see. They were very realistic, well done. And then it said that it was an actual place in Arizona. And then right behind it, you turned around and you had the mammoth with the Clovis points that were in the jawbone and other parts of the mammoth, in the pelvis. And it showed them in situ, like as if they were in the dig, but it was the real thing. And I looked at some of the mammoth hunting points, the Clovis points that were backlit, that were part of that display with the sun, with the electric light coming up from underneath it, with that light shining through those beautiful agates. And as a first grader, I said to myself, I want to be an artist when I get big, and that's the kind of art that I would like to do. So as a first grader, I didn't know what that meant. I had no idea, but that's the kind of art I wanted to produce. So years later, I'm asking everybody questions. I'm living in Guatemala. I'm walking to dig some fish ponds with my father, and we go through all these big archaeological sites, pyramids and fields full of artifacts. And I began to ask my dad, how did they produce this stuff? And he said something to me that was interesting, because I knew that the stuff that was being produced in those days was harder than steel, because he taught me about the Mohs hardness scale, and flints and agates and all those things were as hard or harder than steel. And I said, well, without grinding wheels and steel and electricity, how did they shape this stuff? My dad didn't know. He's a true scientist. My father said, we don't really know. And then he would say, true science is we don't really know, and these are the pieces of evidence that we have. These are the data that we've collected, and this is what we think based on the data. And nowadays they know. Nowadays people do know how things were done a lot more clearly, because of practitioners who've actually started making things, like myself and lots of our friends. So that's how it started, was me asking. But the big jump, the big 30,000 year leap, was I was looking in a Whole Earth catalog, access to books and tools, the same Whole Earth catalog that Steve Jobs was looking in about how to find different ways to present ideas and calligraphy and stuff. And I was inspired in 1970 as a 12-year-old to look into that catalog, because there were lots and lots of pictures of women having babies in the midwifery section. And I wanted to know where we came from. I was curious. I was excited. I wanted to be part of that somehow. And so I would look at that. I was embarrassed. I thought people would think I was being bad, or that there was something improper about it. So I would hide in the medicine closet at the clinic in Guatemala where we were working, and it was a Canadian nurse, a really nice lady, that brought the catalog. And so I would hide in there and look at the midwifery section. And one day, while turning every single page, because there was so many amazing things on every page, I saw a book from Brigham Young University Press by Larry Dean Olson, Outdoor Survival Skills. And amongst other things that you could learn in that book was how to flint knap. That's the word. I learned the word for it. I saw some of the tools. And I went to my father, who was a very, very, I would say, kind of serious dude. He was a Marine Corps colonel who'd fought in Second World War in Korea and seen lots and lots of action. Full bird colonel, seen a lot of hard things, and was somebody who wasn't very funny to most people unless you knew him real well. Then you'd realize he's got a great, dry, Welsh, Scottish sense of humor. But I asked him for the money it took to order that book. Now in Guatemala in those days, people were making a man was making 25 cents a day, working 16-hour days. So to ask for the $7 and something for a book out of a catalog, I was really scared. And I'd never asked my father for money before or since. I never asked for money in my life. I didn't even like money, but I wanted that book. So I went to my father and I said, I'd like to order a book. And he looked at me and said, I think that's a wise investment. So he was surprised that his kid wanted a book and rather than some kind of weird toy or something. So he gave me the money. 6 months later, I got the book. And that was the beginning of me becoming a closet Aboriginal, a closet learner and doer of the word. And so I became totally enthralled with practicing everything in Larry's book. So that's how I got started, was Larry's book. And almost everybody I've ever met that knows anything either learned from that book or learned from somebody that learned from that book. And even the people who claim to have learned it from Apache grandfathers lied and said that they got it from an Apache grandfather when they actually got it from Larry Dean Olson and all the things that he somehow collected from lots of other neat people and lots of Paiutes and stories, and just super neat book that he produced in 1968, I think it was. And that was kind of the grandpa. He's the grandpa of the white revival of Stone Age living skills. It's spread out a little bit to other cultures now, but I know quite a few Native Americans that didn't know anything about that kind of stuff, that learned how to flint knap from either me or somebody else or the book, and lots of other skills that had been lost. And so Larry went and found information and people that still knew him how to make things happen. And then the next book I read, so that it was a big part of that, the same year my sister-in-law gave me Ishi and Ishi of Two Worlds. So between Larry's book and Ishi and the anthropologist that saved the information that Ishi had, this skinny little white kid started thinking he could become a Paiute or live on the land rather than go out and pretend to live on the land. So it really opened up my heart. I wanted to go off. When I graduated from high school, I promised I was going to go live in the wild and never come back to society. What brought me back was the same reason I was looking at the midwifery section. I kept looking for a woman that wanted to live in a cave with me, and I never quite found her. So my catch-22 is wanting to be a caveman and wanting a girlfriend or a wife. And so that's turned out to a lot of middle ground, way worth it, but still leaves me often aching for time on the trail to go eat wild and live wild and feel the earth, not with a piece of clothing between me and her, but right next to her, skin to skin. So that's how it started. So years later, right down off the hill here, about 30 yards from where I'm sitting, I was living in a wickiup with my son Juan, and Westcott shows up after I met him a couple days later and says, "Show me your hand drill." I saw a truck go by, and I recognized the truck because it was Boulder Outdoor Survival School's old Chevy. And Dave Westcott was driving it. And he said hi, and he said he heard that I could do a hand drill fire. And nobody was doing them in those days. And I guess he got a call from Larry Dean Olson that there was a kid someplace on, in southern Utah that could do a hand drill fire. And I was him. And Westcott and I saw each other, and we'd heard each other's names a lot because he was in the BYU programs and had been running them for a while with Doug Nelson and running courses. Right about the same time I came in, he was moving on.
David and I have been moving in parallel paths for a long time. David Holladay and I have been married. Here's a Freudian slip.
Okay, I'll cut it.
Yeah. David Holladay and I have been moving in parallel paths for years. We had been moving in parallel paths for years. And so when I left the survival programs, I went to work for Outward Bound for a couple of years. And he came into the programs after I had left. And so I kept hearing, do you know David Holladay? Well, it's like this, everybody says, do you know David Holladay? Well, yeah, of course, that's everybody's claim to fame is knowing David Holladay. So everybody's favorite primitive skills person. So so I had heard about him, and everybody says you need to meet him, you guys are the same, and yada, yada, yada. And so it wasn't until I came back and took over Boss about 1980, well, I took it over in 85. And so I think I met him in the summer of 80s, probably 87, I think, was when we finally ran into each other. And it was just interesting connection. There was no doubt about it. And so he was teaching at Tucson Public Schools and coming up to live on his property at Boulder during the summers with his son. And so that's why we had never met, was because his travels back and forth and my travels to Boulder, that just didn't ever jive until that particular time. And so we finally met, and it was like we had this long conversation about who really knew what to do, who walked the walk and who talked the talk, and who, the difference between the two. And so we were having this big long conversation about who could do skills and just could talk about them and not do them. And so then we got into this discussion about hand drills, and Dave said, I could do a hand drill. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. So he started doing a hand drill, and well, it's like doing it on TV. If somebody's filming you, it's never going to work. You're always going to run out of breath, or things aren't going to work quite right. And so you're always fumbling around whenever you do. You can do it 100 times by yourself, and then when you have to really put on a show, that's when it doesn't work. And so it wasn't working. And I didn't know as much about David at the time, but he's probably the most bullheaded, stubborn person I've ever known in my entire life. I mean, if he says he's going to do it, he'll do it, which makes him very dependable that way. So anyway, so he was doing a hand drill. My wife was there, and he finally had done it long enough to where he developed blisters on the palms of his hands about the size of silver dollars.
And we've been talking a lot about ingenuous people who talk a lot about what they know, but they really can't do anything. And I didn't know who he was referring to, but I said, yeah, me too. I hate hypocrisy also. And so then after a long, introduction to his wife and me, I and him, and we talk about how we've never met each other much, but we've heard each other a lot. I was living with hardly any clothes on. I had a son who was 4. I'd been making hand drill fires all summer long. My fireboard was nothing but holes, and my muscles were strong, and I was ready to show off. And so I proceeded to fail at making a hand drill fire on a clear day for about 20 or 30 tries. And I don't know how much time it took because I was so focused, but it began to look different. It looked like it was getting darker. And finally, Paula, Dave's wife, Paula Westcott, says, we believe you can do a fire. We can tell by looking at your hand drill set that you've made a lot of fires, but we've got to go. And they both kind of looked at me with pity and took off.
And I think one of them popped in the process and got on my wife, and we finally just said, that's nice, David. I believe you. You can stop now. And no, I can do it. And so we finally gave up and went back to town, which was probably about 7 miles from his house.
And my son and I were so, used to going to bed when the sun goes down. This was probably 9 o'clock at night in the summertime, right? So it's still light a little bit. But I was so exhausted, and I had such huge blisters on both hands that I looked at that hand drill, and I looked at that hearth, that fireboard, and I said, I wonder why this didn't work. And I was so discouraged that I threw it about 15 feet, and I remember it landing and hitting in the middle of a sumac bush and then dropping into the sand. And I remember laying down and sleeping next to the fire. We already had a fire going because I think Juan was already cooking himself some food, my 4-year-old. Well, I fall asleep, and unlike my normal night, I do not wake up again. And when I wake up in the morning, my face is in the sand. I'm breathing in sand, and I'm right where I laid down. And the first thing I see 15 feet away is that hand drill set and that hearth, and I'm thinking to myself, I wonder why that didn't work. So I just walked over there and grabbed it, and I had great big blisters, but I powered down on that thing, popped my blisters as I was going, and I made a spark on the first time down. And I thought, I wonder why that didn't happen while they were watching. So then I wake my son up, make an Apache match or a fire match, a fire bundle, fire carrying match, about this long, put my son on my shoulders, and I walk up over that mesa right there. And I get up on the flats and I walk across another taller mesa. So I get up on the flats and go up on the higher mesa, drop in, and I save about 3 miles to get to Boulder. It's 7 miles on the road, or 7.5 from here, but it's about 3 miles and something through there. And I walk to Dave Westcott's trailer, and by then it's 7 in the morning. So I must have got up pretty early. And I knock on his door, and then I blow on my Apache match. I called him Apache match. I'm the one that started that. I don't know if that's accurate to anybody else's history, but I just like the way that sounds, and I like the way the Apaches make them, or made them. And I blow on that thing, and it comes on to flame right there on his porch at the Boss trailer when it used to be by the museum in Boulder, Utah. And he's in his boxer shorts. He looks at the flame, and he goes, "Oh, I'll be right there." And he goes and gets his clothes on, comes back out, and he says, "Show us how you do the fire."
Next morning, I got a knock on the door. Here's David Holladay standing on my doorstep with a tinder bundle going, "See, I can do it." We had done it after we left and walked to town the next morning to show me that he could actually do a hand drill fire, which in today's parlance is no big deal because hand drill fires are pervasive. Everybody's doing them. It's like no big thing. Well, in 1988, when we did our first rabbit stick, the only person doing hand drills in the country that I knew of was Jim Riggs. And so when we did the first rabbit stick, there was 48 instructors and 2 students. While we sat around, all we did was we would focus on a topic, then when we get tired of that, we could move to the next one. Well, Jim Riggs was the man on hand drill fires.
So we go over to the museum, to the replica of some rooms that they'd made back in the 70s, and we sit down in front of there, and my blisters are healed again, or at least sealed to the full of water, and I go down that spindle first try, and it pops that blister and squirts that white blood cell liquid all over the place. I think it even squirts a couple people around me. They claim they don't remember that. I remember it being very uncomfortable. And I go down the spindle just a few times and I got a spark. And I said, that's how you do it. And so years later, I was working for Boss, and he was introducing me to a class, and he said, Dave Holladay, you're going to be your instructor. You're going to like him. It's your 28-day trip, and you're going to like this guy. And it's the first time I actually heard him say something positive about me, because he didn't say negative or positive. He just didn't talk much. So I was like, wow, he likes me. And then he said, and what impresses me most isn't that he can do hand drill fires. It's the fact that he'd walk a long ways to keep his word. And that was the first big compliment he ever made to me. And that was the beginning of a great working relationship.
And unfortunately, Jim passed away just a couple weeks ago, but he was the one that kind of got everybody started on that thing. Well, then it just spread like wildfire to where now it's just a common thing. And that has to do with a lot of these skills. I mean, a lot of these skills, we struggled with them for years, trying to figure out how to do them. But now there are people who are learning them in a matter of weeks who are heads and shoulders above what my skill level is, just because there are people who have developed those skills to the point to where they're standing on their shoulders now and saying, okay, the level of skill that they have now, they can access much faster than we ever could, just because, not because of necessarily the information, but because of the level of instruction that's available now. So David was one of those guys, and so he was doing stuff that I had never seen before, and so we brought him in to be one of our lead instructors at Boss when I owned Boss, and it's just been kind of one of those things ever since. We've traveled all over together, we've done programs together, we've worked on different projects together, and we've just been very good friends ever since.
And I became senior skills instructor and senior instructor for Outdoor Survival Skill School, Boulder Outdoor Survival Skill School, for about the next 18 years. So that was the beginning of a really good working relationship with, I think, one of the best men I've ever met, regardless of what anybody else in the whole wide world might know about him or think about him. My relationship with him is wonderful, and I think most people that know him agree that he's a man of integrity and that he's a really good craftsman, really good at anything he decides to do, and very honest. And that's what I like about him.
Yeah, I've been making stone axes since I was about 12, since I found Larry's book. And here's one that's in the process of being made. It's going to be a long, kind of a grub hoe. This is a Veracite axe, which is all, it would work, but it's for looks. It's just beauty. I don't know anybody that has a Veracite axe, so I made this about 15 years ago.
Soapstone?
No, Veracite is a strong kind of turquoise-like rock that we have here in Utah. And this is a really nice piece of it. And then this is a hard type of serpentine out of central Arizona.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll chop. It's good. It's a really tough piece. This is a piece of diorite, and that's also a grub hoe style. That'll chop wood and bash brush out of the ground when you're farming. That groove right there is for putting a wedge in after you've put the handle on. Maybe we'll put a handle on one of these today to show you how they work.
Okay.
This is a Celt style axe. I have lots of those, and they go into a handle. And I will show you one of those too that's already put together. But these are all celts for chopping down trees. This is what woodland cultures use to chop down trees and make canoes and split logs and build barricades and walls and everything else.
Back in the 60s and 70s, Brigham Young University outdoor education programs were running summer survival programs down here in southern Utah, and a lot of times trips were 30 days, but they'd go up to 300 and something miles in 30 days. That's a lot of hiking and a lot of minimal gear, primitive survival. And when they'd get up in the high country, they would often build really nice shelters because it's colder at night and there's a lot of materials. And so right here in this meadow, across the meadow, they built a bunch of wickiups, which is a Paiute style log and litter lodge, meaning things like duff, leaves, lots of pine needles, whatever it takes to make them rainproof and make a more dead airspace. So wickiups are a Paiute style house. This is what the Utes and the Paiutes lived in when they weren't using caves or skin shelters or teepees or whatever. So this style of house was built a long time ago. They built up in here. They built some hogans. They built some wickiups. They built lots of different shelters. And as time went on and their outdoor programs changed hands, people started sort of maintaining some of the older ones that were across the meadow. And then one day back in the 80s, Dave Westcott, who was the owner of Boulder Outdoor Survival School at the time, looked across the meadow and said, I think we should move them out of all those quaking aspen groves that are falling over and move them over here. So we moved them across the way, and they pretty much have been maintained ever since. This one we're sitting by is an open teaching one, and John Olson, one of our great instructors during the 90s and early 2000s, he said we need one that's wide open on one side so we can actually see what we're doing on rainy days and and sit inside, not have to be in the smoke. So he built the opening in the side of this one that you now see behind me. And he's the last person I know of that did a lot of real major, what I'd call raging refurbishing of these wickiups. I haven't been working around here for a long time, so I come here and use them and enjoy them and throw a little duff on them now and then. But I don't know if anybody's taken really good care of them for a long, long time by actually really taking them apart and putting them back together and fixing them up. But people have been maintaining them ever since the late 60s. I have some exotic materials from far away. This is seep willow, probably from Arizona. This is some cottonwood root from down in the lower canyons, maybe about 7 miles from here. And then this is a hot dog stick that somebody threw down on the ground up here. And this is some baling twine that somebody took off a bale of hay that were feeding their horse at a hunting camp about a half mile from here. So while walking around up to this camp, I thought, well, what if we wanted to get a a fire going up here from local materials. Maybe not local in terms of, you know, they're exotics, but they were here. They were lying around because so many things have been left around this part of the world for teaching. I got the stuff to attempt a hand drill fire. And even if I get a coal, I don't really have a fire yet. Gotta take, oh, by the way, this ring helps you lower your IQ within seconds. See that? Pretty good, huh?
Nice.
Yeah. And sometimes to be a caveman, you don't really need to lower your IQ. You just need to grunge. Okay. This is gonna polish before it catches any kind of friction we need. So I gotta get it going first. When it gets black and ready to use, or seated we call it, gets a nice little seat where it's gonna stay. Okay. Now, since I have the tools, I'm going to do what it takes to decrease the amount of energy I got to spend to make this happen. I'm on the 90-year plan. I don't want to be a Spartan. I want to play low and slow. Save my energy for more fun things. Not got the right color. It's drilling a hole right through my board, but it's making it.
Yeah, but you busted a coal.
The last person to come through here was nice enough to leave a little bit of juniper bark here. Fire, thundera. You know, the whole time I was faking it, I actually had stone tools. I just wanted to show you that I can use steel.
There you go.
Okay.